This weekend, I found myself standing in the middle of a college campus quad, watching my teenager excitedly point out the buildings where they might take classes next year. And suddenly it hit me. That familiar tightness in my chest, the lump in my throat, that this huge change is actually happening. Soon, our house will be an empty nest. One less voice, one less pair of shoes by the door. And I realized I was both incredibly proud as well as completely terrified, not gonna lie. On the drive home, I started thinking about how this feeling of excited dread that felt oddly familiar is the exact same feeling that I had when I had to first hire a team when I was learning to delegate important client work, when I actually stepped back from doing everything myself. That's when it clicked. The discomfort of change isn't just about loss, it's also about growth. Today, we're going to be talking about how the hardest changes often signal that the most important growth is happening, both in our personal as well as our professional lives and our leadership. Hey there, friends. Welcome to Lead with Soul, the podcast for women leaders who are done with overcomplicating success. I am your host, Meghna. Today, we're diving into something a little different, a little more personal, but incredibly relevant for every woman who is navigating both leadership as well as life. How to recognize that when change feels the hardest, it is often because the most significant growth is. So full disclosure, this episode is coming straight from my heart today. Because my family just spent this past weekend touring colleges. Yes, my youngest is headed off to college. She's ready to spread her wings. And let me tell you, nothing prepares you for watching your child, your baby, excitedly plan a future that does not include you, daily dinners, at home, or you driving her around. And I found myself having these two completely contradictory thoughts simultaneously. I am so proud and excited for this new chapter, but also please don't leave me. I am not ready. Anyone else been there? Or maybe you are approaching that stage and are already dreading what's coming next and feeling those anticipatory emotions, right? It's so human. This tension between wanting growth and fearing change. Because logically knowing that something is good and emotionally struggling with the transition is very real. But here's what I realized on our flight home from the campus visits. This tension doesn't just show up in our personal lives. It shows up in our businesses and our leadership too. It's there when our first team member is brought on board, when we delegate important work, when we take a step back from being in the weeds, from taking care of the details, and also understanding how to navigate this tension might be one of the most important skills we can develop as leaders. So today, we are exploring this dance between change and growth. How to recognize that the hardest changes often signify the most important evolutions, and how to move through them with grace and less resistance. Here's what you and I are going to cover in our time together today. Why change feels so threatening, even when it's positive. The 3 phases of transition that nobody tells us about. How to recognize growth disguised as loss, and what my journey towards empty nesting is teaching me about leadership, and of course, practical ways to navigate this change with more grace in both life as well as business. Because here's the truth. See, we cannot grow without change, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy or that it has to be easy. And understanding that psychology behind our resistance might be the key to embracing the transformation that we actually want. So let's start with understanding why change feels so threatening, even when it's objectively positive. See, from a neuroscience perspective, our brains are literally wired to perceive change as a threat. All our brain wants to do is keep us safe, right? Our primitive brain does not distinguish between good change and bad change. It just knows that change requires energy, attention, adaptation. Change creates uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers that threat response. But there's something that's happening on a deeper level too, especially with those major life transitions, like our kids leaving home or significant business evolutions. These changes often trigger what psychologists call identity quakes. Those moments where we see ourselves as fundamentally challenged. So let me share what this looked like me for this weekend, right? As we toured the college campuses, I wasn't just thinking about practical considerations like dorm rooms and meal plans. I was grappling with deeper questions. Who am I if I'm not actively parenting on a daily basis? What is our family dynamic going to look like when it's just my husband and I at home? What parts of my identity have been so wrapped up in being a hands-on mom that I might actually feel lost without my girls at home? And I noticed how similar these questions were to the ones I faced at key inflection points in my business. Who am I if I'm not doing every task myself? What is my value if I'm not the one who's directly creating every deliverable? How do I lead when I'm not in the details of everything? See, in both contexts, the discomfort wasn't about the practical changes. It was about the identity shift that accompanied them. This brings us to the 3 phases of transition that nobody talks about, really. Psychologist William Bridges, I believe, identified these 3 phases, and understanding them has been incredibly helpful for me in both my personal as well as professional transitions. So phase 1 is the ending. Before a new beginning can emerge, something has to end. That it might sound obvious, but we very often try to skip this phase because it can be so painful. In the context of my youngest going to college, the ending is clear, right? The end of daily parenting in the way that I have known it for the past 18 years with her. The end of our family's current dynamic, the end of a phase of life that I have grown comfortable with despite its challenges. And in business, endings might look like the end of being involved in every client interaction, the end of having control over every little detail, the end of being the primary relationship holder with those who we serve, the end of certain ways of working because they no longer serve our growth. These endings require acknowledgement. Even a form of grief, yes, take the time. So what if that change is positive, right? Denying that sense of loss is only going to prolong that transition. Then there's phase 2, the neutral zone. This is the messy middle. This is the space between what was and what will be. And it's characterized by confusion, uncertainty, and very often a sense of emptiness. See, in my personal life, I am anticipating that neutral zone is going to come in after move-in day. Those first weeks or months of adjustment to a quieter house, different routines, a new family dynamic. In leadership, though, that neutral zone appears when you have started delegating, but you're not yet comfortable in your new role. You have hired a team, but you haven't fully established new systems. You've stepped back from certain activities, but you haven't yet filled that space with higher leverage work. That neutral zone is uncomfortable, but it is also fertile ground for creativity and growth. This is where new possibilities emerge, if we can resist the urge to rush through it. Phase 3 is the new beginning. This is where new identities, new patterns, new ways of being take shape. It is the phase we are all eager to reach, but it cannot be rushed. So for empty nesters, that new beginning might involve discovering new rhythms and routines, maybe yoga class every Wednesday, rekindling relationships with our partners, with our friends who we maybe haven't had time for, exploring new interests that took a backseat during intensive parenting years, developing a new type of relationship with adult children. In business, new beginnings look like settling into that new leadership role with confidence, trusting your team, trusting their unique approaches, finding joy in strategic growth in the creativity rather than daily implementation. Seeing your business thrive in ways it could not when it was just you doing everything. The key insight is that all these phases are necessary. We cannot skip to the ending or rush through the neutral zone without consequences. See, understanding where we are in that transition can help us navigate it more. Now let's talk about how to recognize growth disguised as loss, because this is where the magic happens. In nearly every significant transition, what feels like loss on one level actually creates space for growth on another. But if we are only willing to look at this beyond that immediate discomfort. See, as I contemplate the impending empty nest, I have been trying to identify what new growth this change might enable. The space to deepen my relationship with my husband without the daily logistics of parenting, right? More time, more energy for creative projects that have been on the back burner for both of us. The joy of watching our children develop independence and their own life, creating their own life path. The opportunity to relate to our children as emerging adults rather than as dependent young kids. Similarly, in business, what initially feels like loss often creates space for significant growth, letting go of control. This enables our team to flourish, to bring their fresh perspectives and innovations. Stepping back from the daily implementation creates space for vision, strategy. Delegating client relationships allows for business scaling beyond just your personal bandwidth. Releasing the need to be in every minute detail is going to create this space for being able to look at the bigger picture. I once had a client who struggled enormously when she first hired her team. She described feeling less than because she was no longer doing every task herself. She questioned her value, her role. But 6 months later, she shared a revelation. She said, I thought I was losing my connection to the work. But what I found that I was actually gaining the ability to see the entire landscape of my business in a way I had never done before. And that is what I mean by growth disguised as loss. What initially feels like a diminishment often turns out to be an expansion, only if we are willing to move through that discomfort to discover it. Let's talk specifically about what my journey towards empty nesting is teaching me about leadership, because those parallels have been fascinating to observe. Lesson number 1, trust is a practice. It is not a destination. As parents, we spend years gradually expanding our children's freedom while maintaining appropriate boundaries, right? We practice trust incrementally. First, smaller freedoms, then larger ones, and then we hand them the keys to a car and trust that they're going to stay safe and keep people around them safe. All of this with the ultimate act of trust that is launching them into independent adulthood. I realize this is exactly the same process effective leaders use with their teams. We start with smaller responsibilities. We provide appropriate support and guidance. We gradually expand their autonomy. We learn to trust their judgment, even when it is different from ours. And we ultimately trust them to carry important aspects of the business forward. In both parenting as well as leadership, trust is not something that you either have or you don't have. It is a muscle that you build through consistent practice and intentional risk-taking. Lesson number 2. Your job is to work yourself out of a job. See, the ultimate goal of parenting is to raise adults who no longer need us on a daily basis. They don't no longer need our daily guidance because essentially we are working ourselves out of that day-to-day management job, right? This shift in perspective transformed how I view leadership as well. Great leaders don't create dependency. They create capability. They create capacity. Your job isn't to be needed in every minute decision, but to develop a team that can function beautifully without your constant involvement. This does not mean that you become irrelevant. Far from it. Just as the parent-child relationship evolves into something different, but equally meaningful, your leadership role evolves from manager to mentor, from director to visionary. Lesson 3. The goal isn't control, it's influence. As my child prepares to leave for college, I am actually aware that my ability to control her daily choices is ending. But my influence, the values, the perspectives, the approaches that I have shared over years, those are going to persist. Similarly, as your business grows and your team expands, you cannot and you should not control every minute detail, but your influence, your core values, your vision, your leadership, your culture, all of this is going to shape the direction even when you're not there physically or directly involved in each decision. This shift from control to influence is not a downgrade. It is an evolution towards a more mature and scalable leadership. Lesson number 4. Your discomfort is not necessarily a problem to be solved. Perhaps the most profound parallel I have noticed is this. The discomfort I feel about my child leaving isn't something to be fixed. It's the natural emotional response to a significant life transition. Similarly, the discomfort that leaders feel when stepping back from a hands-on work that we've been doing is not a sign that something's wrong. It's the natural growing pains that we have as evolving, as our leadership evolves, right? In both cases, the discomfort isn't the problem. It's just information, right? It's telling you that, hey, meaningful change is happening. Growth is happening. You're in transition. The problem arises when we try to avoid the discomfort or we try to end it by clinging to old patterns that no longer serve us. So how do we navigate these transitions with more grace and less resistance? Here are some practical approaches that have helped me in both personal and professional contexts. I would love to hear if you have something that has helped you. Please drop it in the comments. Let's have a conversation about this. Strategy number 1, name it. Give that ending a name. Explicitly acknowledge what is ending or changing. Bring it out of the shadows and into the light where you can process it more effectively. So for our emptiness transition, my husband and I are naming specific aspects of daily parenting we are going to miss. Impromptu conversations in the kitchen, the energy and the noise of teenagers in the house, being the go-to person for daily problems and collaborations. I can't imagine that I used to get annoyed with the mom that used to happen. You know what I'm talking about? Also the structured rhythm that comes with school schedules and activities. For leadership transitions, you might name the satisfaction of direct client interactions, the control over how every task is completed, the clarity of doing rather than learning, the immediate feedback loop of hands-on work. Just naming these endings is going to help process the emotional response of being by unexpected feelings. And hey, they're going to come up and it's okay. We just have to make sure we don't squish them down, but actually learn to process these. Strategy number 2, create intentional rituals. Transitions actually benefit enormously from rituals that help us mark the passage from one phase to another. So for this empty nest transition, this might include a special trip or an experience before college begins, a meaningful conversation about this new chapter, a symbolic gift that marks that transition, a new tradition maybe for staying connected across the distance, right? In business transitions, you could consider a formal ceremony for passing the baton, the responsibilities to your team members, a retreat to envision your new leadership role, a symbolic clearing of your schedule for strategic work, stuff that you never had time for, new communication rhythms that fit your evolving role. These rituals help us consciously move through transitions rather than just letting them happen to us, right? Then strategy number 3, anticipate that neutral zone. Instead of being surprised by the discomfort of that in-between state, plan for it. For that empty nest phase, I am scheduling new activities for those first few weeks, planning how to reimagine spaces in our home, reading about others' experiences, connecting with friends that have been through this. I'm leaning into my mom because she had to let us go, right? Setting expectations with my partner about what challenges might emerge. For leadership transitions, block uncomfortable space in your calendar rather than immediately filling it. Expect productivity to dip during major transitions. Create a safe space to process that emotional aspect. Have a coach you're working with. Lean into your peer support group. Also develop metrics for your new role so you can actually see and measure progress. The neutral zone is actually easier to navigate when you expect and plan for those challenges. Strategy number 4, focus on what you intentionally shift your attention from what you're losing to what you're actually gaining or creating. So in my personal transition, my husband and I are focusing on the joy of watching our children thrive independently, the opportunity to reconnect with my husband, having time for interests that I've had to put on hold or devote as much time to, a new adult relationship with my children. In leadership, I'm focusing on this space to grow, to space to work on my strategic initiatives, the satisfaction of being able to mentor and develop others, the opportunity to grow beyond implementation, the ability to impact beyond just what I have been able to do, right? Extending that impact. We're not denying losses, but what we're trying to do is the loss is not overshadowing the gain. Strategy number 5 is to find identity anchors. During major transitions, it's important we identify aspects of our identity that remain consistent even as others change. So as my parenting role evolves, I am anchoring my values, my principles that transcend daily parenting, my core personality strengths that exist, who I am beyond being a mom, relationships and interests that I have maintained throughout my parenting, And then, of course, my professional identity that continues regardless of where my child lives, right? In leadership, that transition is my purpose, my core purpose, and my mission that transcends specific tasks. Any unique strengths that add value regardless of my role. My vision for impact that continues through the various phases of evolution. This is growth after all. And the fundamental values that are going to guide decisions at every level, no matter where we are. And what these anchors do is they provide stability, even as other factors and aspects of our identity shift and evolve. So what am I doing to apply these approaches in my life right now, right? We're in the middle, we're in the thick of it. And as we are preparing for this transition to college, I am consciously creating space to feel those emotions while excitedly looking forward and sharing her excitement. I've scheduled family time to honor what is ending and also to celebrate the new beginnings. We're having honest conversations about our fears, our hopes for this new chapter. And more importantly, I am reminding myself that this transition, while challenging, I'm not going to lie about it, is actually the successful outcome of parenting. The goal has always been to raise an independent human being who is ready to forge her own path. Similarly in my business, I've come to see that successful leadership means we are able to create a team that's able to function without daily involvement in micromanagement. The initial discomfort of stepping back, it wasn't a sign that I was doing something wrong. It was just evidence that I actually was doing it right. Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. Change is rarely easy, even when it's positive. The discomfort you're feeling in the transition does not mean that you're doing it wrong. It actually means that you're doing it. Growth and evolution naturally involves stretching way beyond what's familiar and comfortable. So whether you are navigating an empty nest, evolving in your leadership, or in the middle of any significant transition, remember, the discomfort itself is often evidence that growth, important growth, is happening. Here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to identify one current or upcoming transition in your life or your business. Name what is ending and what feelings that is bringing up. Consciously identify what new growth this change might enable and create one small ritual to mark this transition. Share this experience. I want to hear about it because if not me, there's others in our community who will understand its significance. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. And if you were listening to this while navigating your own significant transition, whether it's a child leaving home, stepping into a new relationship, stepping into a new leadership role, or a major life change, I see you. And I hope that this conversation has helped you with the growth that is happening alongside that challenge. Come find me on Instagram at Meghna_Dassani. I want to keep this conversation going. How can we embrace change as a sign of growth? I love hearing about what transitions you're navigating, how you're moving with them. Don't forget to join me for next week's episode. Until then, remember, change feels hard. It often means that the most important growth is happening now, and you have got this.